Technical difficulties. Well, this is going to be the good grief plotting, using the stages of grief to plot your novel. So I'm just going to get started with the intro while we try to figure this out. If not, I'll just forego the notes and it'll be fine. But I'm Samantha Rager. So I graduated from the Seton Hill MFA program in June 2013.
I failed.
That's okay.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. We're only going to shame you for the rest of the class.
I don't know what I'm doing.
Nice try.
She's like, I'll just pretend I know how to do the things.
I thought maybe on the display it would be obvious.
Why can't we play from start?
Right?
What's the problem?
It's reversed. It's giving you guys what I'm supposed to see secretly on the laptop, and I got the actual presentation. So hold on, let me.
Very strange.
I'm really quite annoyed with this. Like,
so if we see it and you're telling us, doesn't that give us it twice?
Right? I know. I'm like, is there just? I just don't even want mirror show. Can we mirror show? Is this gonna work? From current slide. Okay, yeah, you're just gonna have this. Okay, yay! At least now you can see the big. Okay, so using stages of grief to plot your novel. So I'm using the Kubler-Ross model. I think this is, if you've heard of the stages of grief, this is pretty much what everybody's heard of. So it's the 5 stages. You've got denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I think most people think like, oh, this is how they go in this order. This is how you're supposed to feel them. And the person who came up with this theory later in their life noted that no, the stages aren't linear, they're not predictable, you can experience them in any order, and I really regret that people misunderstood that. So just a little background on there. So here's a quote I really like. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So for me, when I was plotting a novel, I was really struggling with my character arc. And my character actually did have a death that occurred shortly before the start of the novel, and I was like, well, she's going to have to deal with that, the grief from that death. So I actually started doing some research, and I realized, oh, this idea of like these different stages of grief actually fit really well with the progression of a character arc. So I'm hoping you'll see that too and get some benefit out of this. So when is grief good for plotting? For me, if you want to focus on the internal character arc, because there are different stages of grief, you can literally have already plotted out your novel, or you've got a general plot for your novel, maybe you've already written your manuscript. You can take those stages and sort of see, well, where does it naturally feel like my character would be in this stage, or feeling these emotions? Or if you're not sure, you can go, well, randomly, I'm just going to throw the anger stage in here. How does that change and affect your scenes? If one of their primary underlying emotions as they're going through multiple chapters is that they're really angry at the universe or at things because something has happened. It will alter things. If your main character resists or resents the call to action, they're going to experience a sort of grief because they don't want to go and change. They're happy where they were. That's a type of grief. That's a sadness of, I have to leave home to go take the ring to Mordor. Even Harry Potter, like you're like, oh, he's excited because he's going to Hogwarts. There's no grief there, but he has never been able to grieve the loss of his parents. So that is something he deals with, not just through the first book, but throughout all the books. The main character experiences an actual death or tragedy near or before the start of the story. Most likely, if you're doing that, it's because that death is an important event to the story. But it's not just, oh, this death happened and that triggers them into motion. Yes, that is part of it, but how does that death affect them emotionally throughout the rest of the story? One of my biggest pet peeves is when I'm watching a TV show, and like an important character, side character, whoever gets killed off, and maybe they talk about it for that episode, but then like never again. Maybe one more reference later in the season, like meh, but then it's done. One of the best examples of grief I've ever seen done in a TV series is in the show Rizzoli and Isles. A major side character, I mean, he was one of the team of allies, is written off because the actual actor committed suicide. And so they had to write the character out of the show, and they did it so like very clear, like he can't come back. So he dies in the show, off screen. And I want to say this is like maybe 3 seasons before the series finale. He is talked about throughout multiple episodes that season, and then they're continuously referencing him throughout the rest of the show. In the season finale, series finale, they talk about him. They bring him back, and it's always so emotional. And I think because the writers were going through grief themselves, because the other actors were grieving this character, they knew, like, it's not just a one and done thing, whereas most other people are like, oh, the actor's just going off to another show, kick him out, moving on. These writers continue to honor him, and that was, I mean, amazing. So I highly recommend, if you want to learn a bit more about how to do grief, go watch Rizzoli and Isles. It's a fun show. The first episode is bad. Of the whole the pilot had a whole different tone, but the show itself is really good. You want to make sure that your main character suffers and grows emotionally over the course of the story. You never want to make it easy on your character, so another way to throw other challenges at them, like have them having to deal with grief. Like, okay, you gotta go take that 1 ring to Mordor, but like, you're grieving the loss of, like, the death of whoever, like, oh my god, now you gotta struggle with that, and you wake up in the morning on the forest floor and you're just like, I just don't want to do this, I don't understand. Like, grief is always gonna make everything harder. If you've experienced grief, then you know, like, getting up to make breakfast for yourself in the morning is like, that is taking the ring to Mordor. Like, you just don't want to get out of bed, let alone do what needs to be done. So we're going to dive deeper into the stages. The first stage I'm going to talk about is commonly what people think of as the very first stage, if we were going, like, they're always chronological, and it's denial. This event has happened, and now we have to react to it, and the common reaction is to deny it. Like, it's when, you know, the cops show up at the door, and no, you've got to have, you know, you're wrong. You know, my husband was not just in a car accident and died. You are not coming to tell me, it's somebody else. You need to go double check your information because you're wrong. I was just talking to him. We can't accept the reality of what's happening yet. It's a defense mechanism that we as humans use to buffer that immediate shock because it's so painful, you know, that it would literally knock you out in your butt. So until we're ready to really cope with that, we have to say, like, no, we need to keep a distance from it. So that's where we're denying it. It helps us cope. It makes surviving this event actually possible so that we don't just go find a cliff and walk right off of it. It numbs us to all those overwhelming emotions. So that's part of the denial. I refuse to feel this grief yet. It's not happening. I don't want to be experiencing this. World feels meaningless, overwhelming, even senseless, as we struggle to come to terms with accepting that the event has happened. And it's a way of starting to pace our grief as we're moving through the various stages. Next stage I'm going to talk about is anger. So we've accepted that the event has happened, and we're mad about it. So your character is going to be maybe very upset. I'm trying to think of an example. Can't think of an example off the top of my head, and I think I had it in my notes, which I can't see. But it's a way of protecting the vulnerable core inside. Like, we're all soft and squishy inside, so your character has that soft and squishy inside. And when you're in intense pain, you're going to develop shields. So anger is a very pokey shield, and it's going to keep people back from hurting you further. Like, even if they're trying to comfort you, like, oh, let me give you a hug. Well, like, I'm very squishy. And, like, no, so I'm going to put, you know, the porcupine spines out and keep everybody away. But then you maybe even feel guilty for being angry, especially if it's another character who has died. They're going to feel very guilty about feeling maybe even angry at that person who has died. And then that's going to make them feel more angry. Anger hides other emotions, and it's a shield, so we're putting everything back there. You can't see what's back there. And generally, as humans, we're trained to handle anger, to not get angry and how to control it, to not yell at people. So that's something that we know where the handles are. We know how to grab it, we know how to pull it, we know how to keep it under control. Whereas, you know, things like, oh, well, you can't go just wail in the corner, but you can go yell at the fast food server for getting your order wrong. So there's no limits on anger. It can extend to inanimate objects. You know, you're trying to get your PowerPoint to work and it just will not work, so you grab that laptop. Friends, family, ourselves, people we've lost, strangers, the gods. Anybody can be in the path of the anger of your character. And then another part of it is the feeling of feeling deserted or abandoned, because society generally doesn't like angry people. We tend to ostracize them because it's like, one, it's a violent feeling, and you don't want that anger directed at you. And two, you just need to get over it. You need to not be angry. Like, this is ridiculous. So anger is actually a type of strength, though. When you're in this stage of grief, it is a shield to protect you, but it's also that sword that you can pick up and you can use it against people like your enemy who killed the person you loved, who is making you go on this journey that you don't want to go on. It's something to cling to. It feels solid. And when you're dealing with any type of grief, like, it's just this weird sea of nothingness and loss and pain. And anger is this really strong anchor there that holds you steady. So bargaining, it's a way we try to regain control. So they're forced to go on this journey. Well, what can I do to get out of this? Like, can't you take somebody else? Like, look at that person over there. They're much more athletic. You want them. Or can I offer you anything? Or you're even bargaining with the gods. Just take this pain away from me. Like, what can I don't want to feel this way. It's a weaker defense mechanism, but we still use it. Guilt often accompanies bargaining. We convince ourselves we could have done something differently. If only we had sought help sooner. If only we had done things differently. If only I'd been a better or stronger person, then I wouldn't be going through this, or I could have avoided this. I could have prevented this. And it's because we want life to return to the way it was. Like the quote I had at the beginning, it's the change that causes grief. It's when we're forced to be in a situation of change, and we want to go back, and there is no going back. So we bargain with the pain itself, willing to do anything not to feel that pain. There we go. Depression. So there's typically two types of depression associated with grief. So you have reactions to the matter-of-fact repercussions related to the event. So we get anger at the cost of burial. Like, this is ridiculous. Why is the coffin so expensive? Like the cost, the flowers, the headstones. Like, this is ridiculous. Worry over needing new housing after a breakup. These are the actual logistics of your new situation that you have to deal with. And sadness, regret can dominate that type of depression. There's also a subtle, more private type of depression, as your character is getting ready to say goodbye as they're moving through these stages of grief. So again, it doesn't have to be a person. It could be they're getting ready to say goodbye to their old life. They're getting ready to accept that the situation has changed and is never going to be what it was again. And that is quiet. It's internal. It's not in everybody else's face. We feel empty. It's natural. As more and more grief is moving in, we're accepting that there's an emptiness to it. It's important to know that depression is not a sign of mental illness. So your character is going through the depression stage of grief. It doesn't mean that they have a greater mental health issue going on. They could. That's fine. But it's not clinical depression. It's not something that they need drugs for. It's not something that they're going to have feel the grief throughout their whole life, but it's not that type of depression. It's situational depression, which can fade and go away. So depression after a loss or change is often seen as unnatural, something you need to get over. We often, the pain is lessened, yes, but it takes time. And grief is part of the natural process of healing. So depression is a necessary and natural step in that. You need to be allowed to feel sad that your situation has changed. Even if it's, I got a new job and this is an amazing opportunity, but you have to move across the country and leave your family behind. So it's like, well, you should be excited. You've got a new job. That's awesome. Well, yeah, but I have to go somewhere where I've never been before and I'm scared and I have to leave my family behind. And there is grief in that. So signs of depression include crying, sleep issues, decreased appetite. It could also be increased appetite. So that general feeling of overwhelmed, regretful, loneliness, which I think I misspelled. The final stage, and I'm going to argue that this is going to always be the final stage because it doesn't make sense if you accept at the beginning of your grief, then why would you go through the rest of the stages? Not everybody reaches the acceptance stage of grief. Some people never get beyond anger or denial, so that would be where you would have your flawed heroes, who they never become the successful hero about it, or your villains, especially when they're stuck in anger and denial, and that's why they're the villains. They never got past it. So maybe it's your villain who is dealing with issues of grief. As you move into acceptance, there's a sort of emotional calmness that takes over because you're realizing this is my new reality, and I have to learn how to navigate this new reality. It's not necessarily a happy period, but it's different than depression. Whereas depression, you were fully in your sadness and listening to your emo music and whatever, eating all the popcorn. Here you're getting up and you're moving through your day, but it is that quiet realness of that person I lost is never coming back. My situation has permanently changed, and this is the plan of the universe, but it is what it is kind of attitude. It's often confused with being all right. Oh, look at them, they recovered from the death of whatever, they're back to being fine. We don't, that's not really what it is. They're still thinking about it, you're still dealing with it. So there, like I said, there is still that underlying sadness there. It's about recognizing the reality of the situation, accepting it as the new and permanent reality. We learn to live with the changes and move forward. So I think we would all be familiar with the 3-act structure. Act 1, setup, Act 2, confrontation, Act 3, resolution. You can totally keep using your favorite model for plotting, but here's the 3-act structure with grief. I'm just randomly sort of plugging things in here. So we've got denial right after, so we've got the beginning of your story, right before the inciting incident, maybe they start having the first hints that something is going to change, but no, it's not going to affect me. Katniss in the Hunger Games, other people get chosen for the reaping, but not me and not my sister. That's not going to happen. And then the inciting incident happens, and there's anger at now she's in the Hunger Games. I'm gonna, I didn't put an arrow because I'm well, maybe this whole section they're in the bargaining phase, and then midpoint happens, and now she's in the depression phase, and then we start to go into our descending action, and they've moved into the acceptance. And once you hit acceptance, we're almost at the end of the book. Your character arc is wrapping up. They're ready to go in for that final fight. And they can succeed in that final fight because they accept the reality. They're not still fighting against it. Hero's journey, which we all know. Hero's journey with grief. Again, I put denial at the start, but now we've got bargaining here. The big abyss, the death and rebirth. I feel like that's a good place where we can have depression happening in here. Moving into anger, and again, ending with acceptance because now we're ready to win the day. See someone taking a picture, so I'm going to hold on a second. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Dan Harmon's story circle, but this is becoming another tool for plotting. So if you're not familiar, so we have the first character is in their comfort zone, but they want something. So they enter an unfamiliar situation to get it. They adapt to the unfamiliar situation. They get what they want, but they pay a heavy price for it. And then they return to their familiar situation, but they have changed. Story circle with grief. This one I start with bargaining because they want to get that thing, so they're starting the process of negotiation. They're not really getting the thing, so they're starting to enter depression. They're in this unfamiliar situation. We move them into a big section of anger. They get the thing, but they pay that heavy price. And now there's denial because they got what they wanted, but what did they have to sacrifice for it? And they don't feel okay with the sacrifice. And then again, they move into acceptance. So recovery from grief means claiming your circumstances instead of your circumstances claiming you and your happiness. The stages of grief are the emotional steps a person goes through on their journey to recovery. So that is your character arc. A couple other things to know about grief. Some things that can happen is these concepts of enshrinement and bedevilment. Especially when it's people, but I think you could do this with like anything. If it was a lost item or a lost place, enshrinement is we put it up on a pedestal. Nothing will ever be as perfect as that person who I love that died. Nothing will be ever as perfect as Mayberry, which I had to leave, and now I'm in New York City and I hate it. We build it up in our heads. We can't remember any of the bad stuff, any of the times that we weren't happy there. It's perfect, and we cannot be convinced otherwise, and that's a very dangerous place to be in. Because how can anybody ever live up to somebody who is 100% perfect, or a place which was utopia? But then on the reverse, you have the bedevilment. The person we lost was, the worst person ever, or that place was, was terrible, and I was never, ever, ever, ever happy there. Glad that I'm gone, but then you run the risk of forgetting the good, valuable lessons that you learned there. Father was terrible, he was a horrible person. Well, yeah, but he also taught you how to use a hammer, and that's a useful skill. So both are dangerous behaviors and attitudes to adopt. So you need to remember and accept the good and the bad of both. So your character needs to remember, like, okay, you left the place that you grew up, you thought you hated it. Like, well, what were the good lessons? What were the good times? The good people that were there that are worth saving? The enshrinement thing, like, you've got in a romance, like, okay, she lost her husband. He was the perfect husband. Nobody can ever be as great as that husband. So maybe part of the problem for that romance novel is she has to bring that deceased husband off of that pedestal so that she can let the new love interest in, because otherwise he's not perfect. He's a living person. He's got flaws. He's going to make her mad, or she, and you can't accept that in if, like, well, I had the best already, nothing can ever top it. You won't move forward. So how can you use both of these concepts to make life harder for your character? You don't have to use them both, but they're interesting things to be aware of as you're plotting out your novel with the idea of grief in mind. The essence of recovery from grief is contained in the premise of being totally honest about ourselves in relation to others. We must allow that our perception of others may limit or restrict our recovery. So your character wants to move through the stages of grief. They do. They don't want to be feeling pain. They want to be back to a good, normal life as they can get to it. However, other characters, intentionally and unintentionally, don't want your character to move through the stages of grief. Especially your antagonist is going to want to keep them stalled out, because if you're stuck in anger, then you've got tunnel vision. You can't see the whole picture. Your character can't see the whole picture to then go, oh, well, there's a tool I need over there that's going to help me, win that final fight. Unintentionally, accidentally, they keep punching that bruise. So again, how can you make things harder for your character? Self-sabotaging behaviors. When the pain of grief leads to self-sabotage, or the death of hope, it's no longer productive. So a few examples of basic self-sabotage indicators is staying up late when you have to be up early the next day. So if you're staying up, you got a character staying up till 3 a.m., but they've got a morning meeting, there's a problem there. Choosing to oversleep, so they have to rush to get ready. They stayed up till 3 a.m. and now they're sleeping till 9, but they've got an appointment at 9:30 and it takes 20 minutes for them to commute. Stalking your ex on social media after a breakup. I would love to read that as the start of a romance novel. Like, that heroine just won't let him go. So what are self-sabotaging behaviors that you can give to your main character that's going to slow their progress through the stages of recovery? So those damaged and unfulfilled ghosts of your old self need to be acknowledged. They need to be accepted and invited in and consoled when you make new milestones in your personal development. You have to accept that never thinking about something again is a non-reality. You have to let yourself grieve. So this came from a really interesting thread on Twitter, very long Twitter thread by this person. So it's the concept of re-grieving. So your character has already gone through all the stages of grief. Something might re-trigger that grief to come back. This will be especially useful if you're doing like series and they've lost a character or friend or whatever. So interestingly, as re-grieving applies to trauma and emotional scars, It allows people to grieve for themselves. So if your character was abused, then they are grieving. They're grieving themselves. They're grieving chances they never had, or the parts of themselves that they lost, the pain that they had to go through. So regrieving occurs when as a person moves through life and something triggers the feelings of grief to return. So it could be years ago that a death happened for your character, and they're at graduation of their child, high school graduation of their child, and their significant other should be here, but they're not. And so now you've got to recope with all those feelings, the denial, the anger, whatever. It's maybe not going to take as long this time because you've already gone through all of it, but you have to reprocess those feelings. So it happens at major and even minor milestones for the rest of your character's life. So again, for series books, this is going to be great. You killed off a major character in one of your novels. It's like I was mentioning for Rosalie and Isles, they're not going to not ever remember that death throughout the rest of your 10-book series. They're going to recall it when big things happen and certain small things that remind them of that character they lost. You can't run from it. You can't repress grief. It must be reprocessed every single time it happens. When allowed the proper time to feel, but it's like gently cleaning a wound so it can heal. When you repress, deny, or ignore, it becomes a psychological scar. For writers, that's gold, because your character has already gone through the stages of grief. They don't want to feel it again. They thought they were done with this, so they are going to deny it. And then that wound starts to get a little infected. How is that going to affect your novel or your story? How is that going to affect the characters around them? Because maybe your romance novel, your character has remarried or something. How is that psychological scar of, the grief that they're not feeling going to affect their current relationship? I thought this was interesting. Somebody did a modified version of the Kubler-Ross, and it's the 7 stages of grief. So they added shock as an initial stage. So it says initial paralysis, hearing the bad news, and then denial is the trying to avoid. And then they added this testing stage, which is seeking realistic solutions. So I just thought that this would be an interesting thing of like, well, maybe if you want to mess with it a little bit more, give yourself more challenge, you add in 2 more stages into your plotting stage. So how long would the shock stage last? How long is that testing stage going to last? What does that mean for you in your plot and your character? And here's some questions we can think about. Recall a time that you experienced grief. So as you're trying to figure out how to apply this for your character, we've all experienced grief in different stages, whether it's the loss of a person we love, whether it's the loss of an animal. We had to transfer schools and we didn't want to. We moved places. I'd be very surprised if somebody's like, oh, I've never had anything of grief. It's like, I don't know how you made it this far in life. What was the first emotion you remember feeling when you were grieving? And these are hard things to face because it's asking you to reach into your memory and pull out times that you were painful. So this might be this might cause you to have a period of regrieving. So be careful. I will say that, like, I don't want to cause any emotional distress for anybody. But as writers, we do have to pull out those emotions, even the ones that make us uncomfortable, and we have to analyze, well, why did it make me feel uncomfortable? How exactly did it make me feel uncomfortable? How can I apply that to my character? So as time went by, what was the primary emotion you felt? Did you spend most of your time in the anger stage and you kind of blew through the others really fast? What did you do when you were in the bargaining stage? Somebody you went to the strip joint and you're like, well, here's all the money, just make me happy for a while. Was your way of bargaining of like, oh, well, if I knit a bunch of hats for preemies at the hospital, the universe will see I'm putting out all this good karma and it will send good things my way and it will stop this period of grief. Like, what were you doing? What would your character do? What would be their primary emotion that they're going to feel that they're going to spend a lot of time in, or be like, do the most dramatic actions? What do you remember feeling about how you dealt with each stage? So the anger stage, like, how did you get out of that? How did you cope with anger? How would your character cope? Did you feel yourself moving through the different stages? Were you aware, I felt this way last week, but now I'm feeling a very different way? Is your character aware that they're feeling the different stages, or are they just sort of drifting through, like they're on like one of those inner tubes on like the lazy river at the water park. Is it's just sort of happening to them. So again, how can your experience with grief be applied to your character arc? Your character is going through grief. You went through grief. Help your character through it. What advice could you give them? Think about your plot and the obstacles your main character faces. Where could the stages of grief fit in as natural reactions? So if you've already plotted your novel, again, if you already have a manuscript and you're looking to use this as a way to deepen things, study the different stages a little bit and see if you can start to notice, like, okay, here they're already sort of in anger. How can we ramp that up? How can we add more depth to it? Or maybe you realize, like, okay, well, anger doesn't really work here. I really feel like they'd be more in the denial section here. Again, how is that going to change things? One of my favorite things is to like write the scene and then either like shift the setting. They're in a different area. How is that affecting? So again, emotional, that's part of the setting. So if you said like, okay, they're blissfully ignorant here, well, what if they're ragingly pissed off? How is that going to change elements of your scene and how people are reacting to them, making things easier or harder for characters? What is the pain teaching? Oh no, sorry. Are there places in your story where the main character's inner progression has stalled? For me, that's particularly good because I tend to write to a point and then they like emotionally plateau and they're just kind of here and then like, yay, they saved the day. So for me, that's where I'm like, okay, if I have that arc, I've already planned out of like, okay, well, I know that I need to get them into the bargaining stage. So that's coming. How can I get to them to that emotional point? What is the pain teaching the main character about themselves at this point in their life? Grieve teaches us lessons. So what are they learning about themselves? Are they learning that when they're grieving, they really need to call on their allies for support? Or they become more self-sufficient, like before, like, oh yeah, they needed a lot of hand-holding, but now that they're going through this grief, like actually they're able to get up and go and like grab their sword on their own and go, beat back the trolls. What is the pain teaching the main character about how to be compassionate to others at this point in their life? The villain who stalled out maybe in denial and anger didn't learn to be compassionate, didn't learn to help others. But if you've got a hero, Frodo and Sam, they had grief, but they became very empathetic and sympathized, and they're going off and saving the day. So here are some citations that I use. So the Grief Recovery Handbook, Stages of Grief, and then there was a couple articles, and then the re-grieving thread, which I really liked. So I'm going to open it up for questions and discussions, and yes.
So I'm working on a character, and she's grieving the loss of her mother.
Mm-hmm.
But part of it, I guess, I started writing, and it's like she fears death too,
mm-hmm.
and I'm trying to figure out where that fear is coming. Like if that's an innate character trait for her, or if that's part of this grieving process she's going through. I haven't quite nailed it down yet. But did you read anything like in your about something like that?
Oh yes, I did, and I didn't put anything in. Thank you. I'll add that for the next time I do this. So fear of death is definitely a thing. My older sister was really afraid of death. My eldest niece, who is 10, is also around deathly afraid of death, like panic attacks and whatnot. And neither of them had ever experienced death and had to go through grieving until much later in life. I think the youngest, the niece, still hasn't. So I'm like, I don't know what she's gonna do when death comes and touches her on the shoulder. I lost 2 family members when I was 3. So I have like a memory of standing at their coffin. So for me, like I didn't have that fear of death. When I then experienced it later on, when I lost another aunt, when I lost my grandpa, when I lost my grandma, it was a little more natural to me because I'd experienced it. So one, I would say, has your character had a bad experience with death, or is it the fear of unknown? Because another child might have at 3 had that fear develop because death came and visited them so early. So try to figure out like what is it in their past that is causing them to feel that way. Did they have a bad reaction to seeing an open casket, or is it just that they've never experienced death, So it is totally foreign to them. What's their culture? Western culture, death is something we don't talk about. It's something we don't deal with. So we are really afraid of it because it is so unknown and it's so taboo. But other cultures, death is part of life. It's something that they talk about. It is not something that is feared. Instead of having the open casket at a funeral home, so again, keeping that separation, the viewing happens in the home. The family prepares the body. So look at culture, what's going on there, and then once you establish where that fear is coming from, then you can see like, okay, well, maybe it's also part of that denial stage. The fear could be coming from the denial of like, this did not happen. I did not lose this person. I am not experiencing this trauma. It's a mistake. It's supposed to be somebody else who's going through it. So, yes.
And it's a lot different when death is pending. With cancer or something, you have like months and you grieve along the way. And when it happens, it's almost, that's where the acceptance comes in.
Sudden death versus like, somebody has the terminal illness. That's going to be different. So the 5 stages of grief actually evolved from the, I don't know, she's a psychologist, can't remember. She was working with terminal patients and noticed that they were going through these stages like consistently. These were the different types of emotions that she saw occurring in the patients and the family members who received the terminal diagnosis. So they'd go through these stages of grief after getting the diagnosis. So that was like a tragedy grief. And then again, after the death happened, the stages of grief happened again, because now you're grieving the actual, like, okay, we've got this diagnosis of like terminal disease, and then the actual like, okay, now they're gone. But like, yeah, it's gonna be different than the cops showing up at the door. Are you the wife of? I have some bad news for you, man. So those types of griefs are different. And grief comes in all sizes. There's really, really big grief, and then there's smaller grief. There's loud grief and there's quiet grief. So it's just establishing how you want it to show up for your character. And it's not to say that the death of a significant other is always big and loud. It could be smaller and quiet. It could be like, oh, maybe that significant other was abusive, and your type of grief is also with guilt, because like, well, you're sort of happy they're gone, you're free, but you can't express that to people because, oh, it was your husband, and maybe nobody else knew. And like, so what do you do? How do you have to deal with your grief then versus grief over losing a job? Like that could be loud, big grief. And people are like, there's other jobs. It was just a job. You were just a cog in the wheel. Why are you so upset about this? It's your character's emotions. They have reasons. It's their right to feel the way they're going to feel. But you have to establish that for the reader so that it makes sense. Because somebody's going to be reading it and going like, I don't understand why they're having this much upset about moving across the country. Like, this is ridiculous. Unless you establish like, no, they've never left home before. They were from a small town where everybody knew each other's names. Their childhood babysitter, like they'd still had dinner with them on Sunday. Like, if you establish that sort of deep rootedness to the place, and then you throw them in New York City and you're showing this big grief, like that makes sense. You've given readers reasons to buy into why they would be that upset at it. Anybody else? We've got more time. I'm going to take more questions.
You mentioned that. Oh, I'm sorry. You mentioned that people, can, go through these stages out of order.
Yes.
And that it's not necessarily linear. But are there people who are bouncing around with, conflicting feelings that come from different stages at the same time?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You can, again, talking about making things more difficult to your character, what if they're in that bargaining stage, but they're also in the anger stage? Like, I love the anger stage, I don't know if you can tell. Love that sword that they can just like eat everybody up with, because then they're going to have the guilt of like, well, I was kind of a dick, and now I've got to go make apologies. But yeah, combine them. See how that plays, because you can have those conflicting emotions, like I was saying, like anger, you're angry and you're yelling at people, or like you're mad at the person who passed away, but then you're guilty at being mad at them because they didn't want to pass away. But that makes you more angry because, dang it, I have a right to feel the way I want to feel. So, yeah, definitely play them both together and just see what that does. Yeah.
And it's more complicated when it's suicide.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, 100%. How do you deal with those things? And again, it doesn't have to be an actual death of a character that they're experiencing, moving away, loss of animals, loss of status, loss of social status. Oh my God, that's a grief there. If your character was wealthy, they had a mansion, they were Lady Elizabeth St. Clair, and then she finds out she's actually a bastard. Oh no, they're turning society, you're out, and now you have to work for a living. There's going to be a lot of grief in that, and again, grieving yourself. You thought you knew who you were, and everything has been a lie. Who do you feel angry at? How do you change your situation? So grief comes for everybody. And that's why I love it with the character arcs, because novels are all about change. It's all about, moving from this was what your normal was, this was your state, and we're moving to something new. And a lot of the time, most of the time, you lose something in that transition. There is a payment you have to make to get from here to this newer place. So what did they lose, and how does that emotionally affect them? Questions? We got 5 minutes. More questions? Anything else? No? I mean, yeah?
I really liked the first quote that you used, but I didn't think about taking a picture. And
that's fine. Let me see if I was before this. Grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern of behavior. So if nothing else, I mean, just, remember this quote.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I loved this quote, because for me, that was like the clouds parting, and they do what they want.
Who's the author?
This was James, so this was, oh God, let me go back to my...
Grief recovery handbook.
Grief, thank you.
Oh.
You got it.
I see it. I got it.
So, I checked out like all the grief recovery handbooks. Like libraries my library system was pulling them from like other libraries to send them to me so that I could just do research for this. So definitely go and read them. Some are better than others with how you can apply it to your novel, because some are like very like, oh, you actually lost a person. Here's like what you're gonna do. You're gonna wake up and you're gonna put on pants. So I'm like, well, yes, that is a good idea for my character to do. However, I need to know more about like the concepts of grief. And others were really good. I got one that I don't know why I rented it, and then immediately I flipped it up and was like, no. But it was like the Long Island Medium. Like she has a TV show and she has like nails that are like 5 feet long, and the bouffant blonde hair, and she talks to the spirits to help people through their grief. And I think I was expecting something really interesting from that, and I was like, oh no, sweetheart, ba-boom, that door. So, yes.
I was going to say that last year I wrote this story, and it happens after one of the heroine, she has this really awful breakup, and there's these like apps, and now I can't remember. One was like RX breakup, but they're basically, it like walks you through like, today you're not going to get on social media and check it. But one of them had like this journaling capability.
Oh, it's called Mend.
Yes, Mend. Oh my gosh, I did Mend as my character, and it was like amazing. So I bet they have like grief apps too. But
I'm gonna have to look for that.
Yeah.
And there's a Facebook page, Young Widows and Widowers, and everybody is on. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're young or older, but you hear people telling their story.
Yeah. I mean, listen, when you read memoirs or articles about grief, like, definitely see what you can learn from that. Don't steal anybody's story or their life story, like that's how you wind up with lawsuits. Well, Samantha said, like, no, Samantha did not say. But definitely, especially if you're not familiar with the certain types of grief, see where you can find primary sources and like what were those people experiencing. If you've never lost your job, like if you've never, like, for me, so I walked into the elevator on a Friday, and my manager walked into the elevator following me with a packet in his hand, and on the way down, because I'd just been like, bye, see you Monday, goes, we have to talk. So there was definitely a type of grief in that. And I tell the story to other people, and I get a lot of that reaction. And I tell it to people who are in my industry, and I was like, oh, he was a nice guy, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, no, he wasn't. That's really messed up. I'm so sorry that happened to you. But like, I had just been like, oh, well, this is just how I guess it goes, and like hadn't seen from the outside view. So that's the other thing. Like, you're gonna read these stories and you're gonna have an outside view, and like maybe the person is justifying, like I was justifying it, like, no, it's fine, whatever, and did not, I was in the denial of like, I didn't want to, like, this is just how it goes, right? This is the normal way to fire somebody, or let somebody go, you layoffs. So what does your character not see about their situation in grief? What are they normalizing? And that outside characters are being like, are you crazy? No, like that's not okay. Like this is not okay that you're being treated this way, or that you're acting this way, or like. So that's again another interesting thing, and especially if you're writing it maybe first person, like they're normalizing things, and the outside characters who you're not in their heads. How are they reacting? How is your character looking back at them, going like, well, wait, I don't understand why you're so upset. Like it's that situation of like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? You know, so have some fun with it. Have fun with grief, and that is time. So, thank you.
You did fabulously without your notes.
Thank you. I was really like, oh man, this could be iffy. I hope I don't hit 15 minutes and be like, questions.
You know your material after.